Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today I wanted to carry on with something that I started my channel for way back when, which was going through the entire Booker Prize shortlists from the very beginning. And I sort of really like kind of doing this as part of the whole project, and particularly now that we're in Booker longlist season for 2026, I thought it'd be quite fun to cast an eye back on previous shortlists, and so I'll do a few more of these as I go. I think I still have about 20 shortlists that I've not done videos for yet, although I've read all the shortlists from pre-2026. So with that in mind, I'm going to talk about 2016, just 10 years ago, and look a little bit at what was happening in that shortlist then. So yeah, really excited to talk about this and to kind of particularly see how perhaps things have changed or perhaps not changed since then. So let's get talking about the shortlist. So I'll start with the winner and then do the shortlisted authors in alphabetical order from there. But this is a particularly interesting winner from 10 years ago, The Sellout by Paul Beatty. And I will say for all of the shortlist, actually, having a couple of years since I think most of them I read a few years ago. And so actually having a couple of years different, a sort of gap between then and now has actually been quite fun for seeing how some of the books have percolated and which ones sort of stuck with me, which ones I paid a bit less attention to. But the Sellout winning was a particularly interesting win for several reasons. It was the first US winner after the prize had been opened to people from all across the world rather than just the Commonwealth, which it had been up until sort of a few years before this. But also because this book is so it's got quite a lot to say and it's quite provocative, and I think that's what's also really quite special about it. So in The Sellout by Paul Beatty, we have a set of characters, but particularly we are focused on a character who is I mean, yeah, this is where it gets really provocative, where a character is going to the Supreme Court and he is trying to ask the US to reinstate slavery. He is a black man. He is asking for this, and he is trying to get this law changed. And in the meantime, lots of characters have conversations in which they are debating with either with him or sort of speaking more generally about race and race relations in the US. And I mean, right from the jump, you can see how that is provocative. But this is a really odd book because it's this satirical book that's quite funny in the sort of realm of people like Percival Everett, where they take a really complicated topic, one that's really sensitive, one that's fraught with a lot of emotion and difficulty and historical legacy and all of these other things, and completely approach it from this satirical, clever, wild kind of approach. And so this book, I think when I first read it, I sort of was a bit like, oh gosh, okay, we're going there. And I think since the kind of way this book is sort of delivered is so ingenious, and I completely now see why it won. I think when I read it a few years ago, I couldn't just quite connect in with it. And I think sort of letting it percolate has really allowed that, and particularly reading books like Percival Everett's books since has also helped, I think, situate this book a bit for me. But yes, so we have this character who is trying to reinstate slavery, who spends a lot of time in the book talking about how sort of speaking in kind of language of sort of typical language that's used by sort of black slaves in a lot of US films, and so again there's a kind of poking fun at this kind of at the kind of media landscape and the way that black people are only really allowed to play one of two characters in films. And so the book kind of is already poking fun at that and playing around with these ideas. But it then just keeps on developing this idea further. This book just it gets more and more complex and in your face and provocative, and it just keeps on getting more and more bizarre. There are moments of extreme violence and cruelty in this book in some ways, but also that's all through the lens of this satire. And so much of this book is playing around with this idea that actually it by kind of putting a character in the place of wanting to reinstate slavery, it's used as a way of questioning whether the US has really moved on from its legacy from slavery, whether, you know, the kind of almost poking fun at this idea of being post-racial, or that kind of, you know, we had President Obama and therefore racism's gone. It kind of really pokes fun at that kind of argument that was very common in some circles at the time. And so I think this is just a deeply clever and funny novel, whilst also just being really challenging. And actually, I really commend the judges from this year for taking such a, you know, for really batting for a book that is particularly challenging. This is not a kind of easy, you know, bestseller, put it on a little podium in Waterstones, sell it to every single book club who can just read this in a really easy way. This is a book that is intentionally confronting and challenging, but I also think is really brilliant for what it does as well. So yeah, despite not necessarily getting it as much at the time, I think letting this one sit has really worked for me. And so yeah, I think this is a really bold, if challenging, choice as well for a win. Next up, we have a very different novel, Hot Milk by Deborah Levy. And this book is, in sort of, there are quite a few Deborah Levy books that I've read that I've kind of enjoyed for very similar reasons. And this sounds like an odd, I mean this as a really positive thing about her works. She writes about hot summers really beautifully, which feels very appropriate for what's currently happening. But she has this real ability with this, I think with Swimming Home, I think with August Blue, of sort of telling these stories of being somewhere in Southern Europe, typically, and these long hot summers that kind of unravel various qualities of characters. That there's something about being at a remove, about being either on holiday or on some kind of trip or what have you, that brings up some kind of personal quality. It allows characters to breathe differently. It makes me wonder if she writes mostly when she's on holiday, actually. But it also, there's something about the way that the heat brings out, in some ways, the worst and the most sort of desperate qualities of characters. And Hot Milk is very much an example of that. So there is a mother and daughter, and they go to Spain to try and find a cure for sort of medical issues, and particularly sort of a paralysis happening to the mother. And as a result, they spend time within this book trying to figure out what is happening. But this book sort of operates as a bit of a wider sort of discussion, sort of in the micro-macro quality around Europe, and about sort of the 2008 crash that affects Greece, in the sense that we watch Greece and Spain and other countries starting to have this difficulty, this kind of tension that creeps in, that for the characters, you know, this should be, in theory, on paper, a really positive thing of going to this other country that's beautiful and being able to try and find a cure or some kind of treatment for an illness. This should be a really positive, redemptive thing that kind of solves something, but actually there are bigger problems afoot, and actually your privilege as someone who's able to go and explore that country can be challenged. That you are, in one sense, you want to go to sort of be part of this and see these beautiful landscapes, but the country itself could be struggling, the people could be struggling, but you have this sort of ability to pass in and out of that. And it can ruin your holiday, but you can go home at the end. And so there's something about the way that this book starts to build, and particularly there's this moment of a character being obsessed with another character that turns quite dark in some ways, that kind of belies what else is happening with this book. There's this underlying darkness and tension and difficulty to what is otherwise this sort of lush, beautiful landscape. And I think that's something that Deborah Levy does so well in this novel and in many others. So yeah, a really tricky book at times, but I think just a really powerful one. And Deborah Levy is no stranger to a prize listing. And I think this book just feels like there's something so sumptuous about parts of the prose, but also there's this lingering tension that's so tactile at times that I found really interesting. Next up, we have His Bloody Project by Graeme, Macrae, Burnet. And I remember at the time of this book being on the shortlist and long list, there being some discussion, because this felt quite different for the booker to have a book that felt more genre fiction in some ways. And that doesn't happen really commonly with the booker. I mean, it's kind of kind of come in dribs and drabs. It's changed a little bit. It's become a bit more sort of why, you know, it happens a bit more often now. But I think at the time it felt a bit like a different kind of angle. We weren't necessarily as used to having books like this appear, particularly a crime novel. But I think, discussions of literariness aside, it is a really fascinating look at a kind of crime novel through a very literary sensibility. And that's not to take away from either crime or literary fiction within that. But it basically does this really quite interesting thing. It tells a fairly, you know, normal crime story in some ways. We are looking at a murder or sort of set of murders that take place, and there's this sort of brutality and roughness going on. But we also, at the same time, get something else that is quite fun. We get these sort of documents peppered throughout the novel that tell a bit more about the story and invite the reader in to help solve the mystery of what's happened, whilst also kind of adding a richness to this world. And on top of that, the book has this sort of metatextual play that it does, because the book, and even on the front cover of the novel, it says documents relating to the case of Roderick Macrae. And so there is a feeling that you're reading a book that is presenting itself as a sort of non-fiction telling of something that happened. But it is clearly a novel. It is written as a novel, but it sort of is playing as if this has been a set of documents that have been found and somebody's piecing it together. And that's quite fun. It feels quite kind of interactive almost in that respect. But I think this is just a really brilliantly done book. It's so clever in its approach. It really brings you into this kind of crime story. But like with, I think, most of his other books, where he's, the ones that I've read at least, he has this real ability to delve into the crime aspect of what he's telling you, to kind of dig into the mystery and the documents and all this kind of thing, but also to really find some kind of heart with which to talk about the victims and sometimes as well the perpetrators, the sort of difficult ways that their lives have led them to this. Ben Becula, his novel, does this really well, I think, as well, of looking at how somebody can justify to themselves committing various violent acts. And I just think this is a really, really well crafted novel. And I absolutely see why, you know, if you're going to have any crime novels sort of poking through, this feels like a really good example of one that just is just a really clever use of the form of fiction to tell a particular story. I just think this is really, really masterfully done. Next up, we have Eileen by Ottessa Moshfegh. And it's sort of surprising in some ways, but this is Ottessa Moshfegh's only sort of listing in the book so far, I believe. And this is a really quite odd novel. It sort of starts in this very moody kind of way. In a lot of her writing that I've read so far, there's a kind of malaise that falls over a lot of the characters. Of they feel this kind of sense of almost a lack of control over their lives, that they're kind of just living either paycheck to paycheck, or they're kind of just trundling through life and kind of hoping for the best and hoping that one day there'll be a break out of all of this. And that is very much the case sort of early on for the character Eileen herself. She is just sort of floating through life. She has this dream of moving to the city, to New York, and she's sort of just going through the motions a bit. And in that time where she's sort of waiting for the next step to happen, a few things do happen. And without going into spoilers, because this book does go into some quite fascinating plot beats, it is a book that just takes some odd turns. There is suddenly a plot about sort of crime and framing people and all of these other things. And so for Eileen herself, this is both something she feels ill-prepared for, but she's also, in some ways, this is the first bit of action that's ever really happened for her. So there's almost something exciting in this dark sense for the characters, and particularly for Eileen, to feel like there's something happening, that she can move on. She has people who she can call a friend. She can do whatever she needs to do next. And it all kind of starts building in this very dark way. And it's suddenly, towards the end, we get a kind of big reveal of a few sort of things of what's happening next, without spoiling anything. It's a really bizarre and very dark novel, but also one that, I think it sort of feels like trademark or like very like classic Moshfegh in that respect, of just, yeah, this kind of depressive state for all of the characters that in some ways mirrors the US, that it feels like there isn't a national sort of vibe of being excited about the world and excited about whatever's coming next. It feels like there's a bit of a lull, and that's actually where a lot of the characters kind of operate. That's the kind of world that they're in, is there's a bit of a sense of, we once were hopeful and now we're not. And yeah, so I thought this was a really, really interesting book, a really strange one. Yeah, Moshfegh's writing is one of those things where sometimes you don't necessarily enjoy the reading experience as such because everyone's a bit depressed, but it is also quite funny or charming in its own way, and so the book itself kind of carries the day, and I find them quite interesting. But yeah, this is a wild choice alongside some of the others, and sort of sets up actually quite a weird shortlist, in a good way, I think. Next up, we have somebody who's no sort of stranger to the Booker Prize, David Szalay with All That Man Is. And so this was his first listing, and he would go on to win the prize 9 years later. And this is a book that is so interesting in many ways, particularly having now read Flesh, because this book in many ways is a bit of a precursor to Flesh. It's a book that has him really exploring masculinity through I think is it nine different characters. In some ways this is almost short stories more than a novel, but there is an interlinking sort of, at least conceptually or thematically. And so in the book we follow different men in different places as they kind of potter through life. And again, kind of in many ways, this shortlist is full of a lot of malaise. And this sort of exists as well for this, that these 9 men are navigating what it means to be a man in a current landscape. And so much of that feels like, kind of like with Flesh, there's a kind of emotional stuntedness sometimes to them. Some of these men are incredibly stoic and quiet, and we sort of learn about their lives through a series of events rather than interiority or rather than whatever else. And so for some of the men we kind of delve a little bit more into sort of some aspects of their lives, but they are for the most part kind of men that are worried about sort of moving through the world. Are they doing it right? Are they failing? Are they kind of are they unexceptional? Are they whatever else? And there's so much that builds with this. And I think on the surface this sounds like it should be a really dry novel that, in the same way that I think Flesh, from the outside, if you were told it's a novel about a man who doesn't really want to tell you his own life story, you'd kind of balk at the idea. And actually, I know for a lot of people that was people's issue with Flesh. But actually, I think there's something really beautiful and interesting about this, because we get these portraits of these men that are kind of fairly kind of unemotional and sort of unsentimental at times. They are kind of just presented as these beings who kind of just want to sort of do right and don't always really get there. But there's something about it that I found really compelling, that the way it builds into an understanding of these men's lives and the complexity that comes for them in being uncomplex, that kind of men are told a very specific sort of way externally about how they're allowed to behave, that the sort of emotions and interiority are often sort of either disregarded or kind of advised against in some way. And All That Man Is allows for a portrait of that feels like it sort of bridges that divide. It kind of sits on that odd line of basically saying, well, yeah, we're not going to give them too much interiority at times in this book, but we're also going to that's the point, that they are that's kind of the container that we've put them in. So anyway, I think overall it's just quite an interesting book. It's quite a weird one. I think when I first started reading it, I found parts of it a little dull is maybe too strong a word, but a bit kind of impenetrable. And I think it slowly won me over. I think there's something really quite clever going on underneath the hood here. And last but not least, we have Madeleine Thien with Do Not Say We Have Nothing. And this is this sort of sprawling, sumptuous book in many ways, but it deals with so many things. It has so many little offshoots and things that it's dealing with within this book. But it starts from a situation with a girl and her mother. I think the girl is around 10, and they take in a Chinese refugee into their home. And this person has recently fled China from the sort of Tiananmen Square protests. And so there is a kind of political edge about China, its history, its politics woven within the book. And we then go through quite a few different time periods in the novel around various parts of Chinese history. So the Cultural Revolution, a few other sort of moving parts. And this book, I think, then just does something really gorgeous with that, of taking this sort of wide view of history in a way that something like Flashlight did actually sort of fairly recently by Susan Choi, of taking kind of various big historical moments and weaving it through a family history and sort of connected family members. And so we have various people who have either fled or moved at various different points, all these sort of things that go into it. But all of really what kind of starts to break down is this idea of how you view your kind of inheritance of that, how you sort of see your family history as being tied up with a cultural and national history, and what it means if you've left a country, that or you sort of left a certain sort of historical period. You know, you kind of have, I suppose it sort of examines what that looks like for you. You know, if you are now safe, which is great, but now you feel this odd sense of both survivor's guilt and that you're watching from afar as these huge things happen. And in the case of this, you know, you've got characters in Canada. And so what does it look like if you're in Canada and nobody's really talking about what's actually happening elsewhere in the world? You know, this thing that you've escaped that's huge for you is now just a fairly small footnote on the news for Canada or for wherever else. And so I think it then sort of sets up these really interesting things within the novel, and I really greatly enjoyed this. I thought this was just such a cleverly done novel that just has so much heart to it, but is pretty unsparing in talking about some of the brutalities involved in some parts of this history as well. And just I do think Madeleine Thien just has this gorgeous way, I think, of writing. Her novel Book of Records, I think it was last year, I think was really interesting for this as well, of the way that she weaves in memory and history and family and all of these other things. But there's a real heart to it. There's a sense that almost that there are different versions of each historical event. You know, we can talk about the Cultural Revolution, or we can talk about Tiananmen Square, or sort of events happening in Canada or the US or wherever else in the world. And we talk about those often as this sort of factual thing of here, you know, this thing happened, this person was assassinated, and this thing happened. And I think Madeleine Thien is really good at finding the kind of different stories within that story, if that makes sense. So kind of, yes, Tiananmen Square looked like this for a protester, and it looked like this for somebody fleeing. It also looked like this for somebody who stayed, and it looked like this for somebody, you know, she's very good, I think, at finding those human stories within it to kind of challenge this idea of just having a singular story for something. And so I just think this is a gorgeous novel that is just so well observed. Yeah, I thought this was a really well done novel. And I think possibly if I had to choose a winner myself, this would probably be my choice. But yeah, with that, let's get talking about the shortlist as a whole. So taking the shortlist as a whole, as I mentioned, there's this sort of theme of malaise or something happening. And I think this is where sometimes going back over specific years can be really interesting, for me personally at least, to kind of see where our kind of cultural or sort of societal mindset was at. And so 2016, apart from being a year that a certain US president came in for the first time, was also sort of a time that was almost a response as well to a kind of cultural malaise of people feeling that there'd been a sense of hope that was then sort of dashed with things like the 2008 financial crisis or whatever else. And, you know, Deborah Levy explicitly references this sort of economic crisis part, or kind of alludes to it in this big way. But the rest of the characters, most of the other books, particularly if they're focusing on the more modern day, so All That Man Is, and sort of Hot Milk, both engage a bit with kind of current day Do Not Say We Have Nothing and the Sellout and His Bloody Project look a bit further back. And then Eileen is this sort of other thing entirely, but feels like it has a sort of, it's focused, it's around that world of this kind of malaise. But that's what I think is really interesting about viewing the shortlist as a whole, because there is something that the judges have sort of settled on here about a kind of cultural moment of feeling a lack of hope, but then a re-examination of the past through that. So Madeleine Thien's novel really examines sort of family history, and particularly the history of China in so many interesting ways. The Sellout deals directly with history by confronting it in this very provocative, no holds barred kind of way. But I just think this is a really interesting shortlist, and one that actually, I like a lot of these novels, but I feel like this is almost, the shortlist feels like more than some of its parts in some ways, because individually I liked quite a few of these novels, but didn't necessarily fully fall in love with them. But examining them now as a 6 actually makes a lot more sense for me, that there's a sense of something creeping in about what the kind of cultural touchstones were at the time. But yeah, anyway, if I were to choose my personal winners within this, I think Madeleine Thien's novel would probably be my top choice. That, and maybe the Graeme Macrae Burnet novel, His Bloody Project. But actually, like I said, with The Sellout by Paul Beatty, this novel has really sort of percolated in my brain, and I think I appreciate it more now than I did at the time. I think when I first read it, I didn't quite know how to grasp it. And actually 10 years on, I say 10 years on, I read it for the first time only a few years ago, but a few years on, The Sellout actually feels like a book that has endured. Actually, the having conversations like this that are so deeply provocative and challenging and intentionally in your face actually feels very pertinent. This is a novel that does not want an easy answer, and I think that's what really makes it rewarding. And I think particularly for the judges, if you consider that they would have read this 3 times by the time they announced the winner, they'd have read all the books submitted, they would have then reread the long list to choose the shortlist, they'd have reread the shortlist to choose the winner. This is a book where I can see how on a third read, this book really, like the clever machinations of what it's doing become even more apparent, of the way that this book is helping to frame an incredibly emotionally fraught and sensitive conversation through satire and humour and directness. So actually, I think, yeah, this suddenly makes a lot more sense to me as a winner than I think it did when I first approached the novel. But that said, Madeleine Thien's book, Do Not Say We Have Nothing, is gorgeous, and I highly recommend it. And just Madeleine Thien's other novels. Well, I mean, I've only read the Book of Records apart from this. But yeah, incredible writer. But yes, those are my thoughts. Those are the books I really like. It's been really fun to kind of put this hat back on of going back over a shortlist again after 47 years since the last time I did it. But yeah, I'm going to try and do more of these as we go, particularly with the current long list, and particularly once we get down to the shortlist. It'd be really fun, I think, as a comparison point to look at other shortlists from the time. So I'm going to keep on doing it, whether you want that or not. Not as a threat, sounds incredibly threatening, but a kind of, I'd be keen if people are into it as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Anyway, that's been me talking about the shortlist and melting in real time in front of you like a little candle. Take care and have a wonderful time, and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.